For the last few years, a growing number of Sega fans have been clamoring for a Saturn Mini console in the same vein as the Genesis Mini release in 2019. Many Saturn games remain locked to the platform and have not seen reissues in the years since, making the proposition of such a device quite tantalizing. As Saturn emulation improves, we inch ever closer to the reality of this happening, so I decided to do an episode on what a Saturn Mini could possibly look like. I tried to approach this with a very realistic view of the games that Sega would choose. Since CD games take up much more space than the old ROM cartridges, I have chosen just 20 games that I think have a real chance of making it. I have also chosen some games that I feel will definitely not be there for various reasons. Remember, this is not my most wanted list. This is a group of games that I feel would be included on an actual retail release. Aside from that, it's all just for fun, so sit back, relax, and let's talk Sega. Before we get into my 20 picks for the Saturn Mini, let's look at the games I feel will definitely not be on it. One thing that I think Sega will avoid altogether is licensed content. That means games like Daytona USA and even Sega Rally would almost certainly be absent. These games carry real-world licensed content that Sega will not be willing to pay to carry over to a device that will likely have a small margin of profit to begin with. This of course will cover games like Die Hard Arcade as well. The Japanese version called Dynamite Deca may see a showing if the unit was Japanese only, but I don't think an international release would bother. The license debate would also extend to Magic Knight Rayearth unfortunately, so I wouldn't get your hopes up there either. I would imagine none of the Marvel fighting games would be included, nor would any officially licensed sports games. I also feel strongly that Sega would completely avoid light gun games. While you can play Virtua Cop and House of the Dead with a controller, I just don't see that game type being included. Finally, Sonic Jam will likely not be on the Saturn Mini. Whatever Sega's issues are with Sonic 3 and Knuckles will continue on this device as well. Again, Sega will not want to do any complicated licensing or modifications for any of these games. If Sega doesn't own it outright or can't get the rights to it cheap and easy, it won't be here. I also would not have high hopes for anything that would need to be translated. Again, Sega will do as little as possible here, and they will not put a team to task to do anything as complicated as English translations. So those of you hoping to see something like Princess Crown surprise us, it ain't happening. I think it goes without saying, but Nights into Dreams would be here almost certainly. Sega had a few mascot contenders to replace Sonic on the Saturn, and Nights was made in-house by Sonic Team. It's a piece of software that goes hand in hand with the Saturn experience and still is quite fun to play today. This entry would be even better with Christmas Nights as an unlockable. I don't think Sega will load the Saturn Mini down with games from the same IP. I feel this means they'll skip the original Panzer Dragoon and go straight to Panzer II. It's more impressive visually and has some gameplay additions like the evolving dragon that the first didn't have. Sega will shoot for what it perceives as the superior of the two. I also think Panzer Saga has a real chance of being on the Saturn Mini. While it's part of the Panzer universe, it's nothing like the second game, and I think Sega will appreciate the variety. I also think Sega knows the community at large would be much more likely to buy a Saturn Mini if it were included. Even with the original source code lost, this would just be an image of the original, so there is nothing stopping it from happening. One thing that you can count on for sure is Sega's recognition of how important Virtua Fighter was to that era. This is the reason why the Saturn sold the numbers it did in Japan, why it held an early lead on the PlayStation there. It's a landmark title and a shoo-in. And given the popularity of the second game, it's going to be there as well. It improved everything about the original and has more modes to boot. Since Japan will likely be the biggest market for the Saturn Mini, I think this has to be there. It's also one of the platform's better looking games. Sega will include it for sure. I think Sega understands how important Treasures games were to their platforms. They'll also want some variety in the list, and the multiplayer action of Guardian Heroes will fit right in. Multiple paths, multiple endings, and many unlockables give this a great amount of replay value. Sega will need games like this to put asses in the seats. On a similar note, I believe Sega will want Saturn Bomberman. The multiplayer action is unlike anything else on the platform, and Sega seems to have a great relationship with Konami. These games would also give Sega a chance to sell a few peripherals like the 6-player multi-tap. This would give the Saturn Mini an appeal to those looking for a party device to play with their friends. Sega would be crazy not to include at least one of the Shining Force 3 entries. These were A+ strategy games with a great story and deep mechanics. Sega never translated the second or third parts themselves, so it would most likely just be the first, but that's okay. I think it would be a great addition that would attract many more people to the device. This is Sega, so Sonic will have to be there in some capacity. Sonic R, while not the best game in the world, is an easy pick. It's as close to a standalone 3D Sonic as the Saturn ever got, and Sega will want the 2-player action to appeal to the broader of audiences. It also adds a racing game to the mix. Believe it or not, Sonic 3D Blast was one of the better selling games on the Saturn in the Western markets. This will not be lost on Sega and almost guarantees its inclusion here. It's also different enough from Sonic R to not cause too much overlap. As with the Genesis Mini, I think Sega's relationship with Capcom will give us some choice cuts for this product. I think Sega needs a good action platformer, and Mega Man X4 fits that category nicely. It's a great looking and playing game that's popular in both the West and Japan. Mega Man 8 could be here instead, but I'd honestly rather have this one. The Saturn Mini will need at least a few good shoot-'em-ups, so I think Cotton 2 is a big possibility. It was an STV Titan Arcade release that came home virtually untouched. It looks good, has a stellar soundtrack, and has a 2-player mode. Cotton Boomerang could be here as well, but either one would be a welcome addition. Technosoft made some great games for Sega over the years. They know how much fans love those games, and that's why Thunder Force 3 was on the Genesis Mini. I also think that's why Thunder Force 5 is going to be on the Saturn Mini. Generally considered one of the best shooters on the platform, it also has a bunch of polygon elements I think will attract Sega to it. It's only one player, but still a heck of a ride. Adventure games like Legend of Oasis are quite a bit different from the turn-based RPGs that have similar traits. This one relies more on real-time action and exploration, and I think that makes it a perfect fit for the Saturn Mini. It's so different from the Panzer Saga and Shining Force 3 picks we previously went over, and a great game in its own right. The next choice has 2 entries because I believe sternly Sega would change things up between an Eastern and Western release of the Saturn Mini. In Japan, this slot is going to be occupied by Sakura Wars, a dating sim with strategy RPG elements that was extremely popular there. It had multiple mainline entries on the Saturn as well as a number of spin-offs. It's very story heavy with lots of reading and conversations that go on forever. I do not feel Sega will target this to Western audiences, and we are much more likely to get Bug, the pseudo 3D platformer. It sold well in the US and even got a sequel on the Saturn shortly after. It's an easy release for Sega to do since they own the IP. Our next one gets a dual pick as well. In Japan, Iron Storm was an extremely popular WW2 simulator that allowed you to pick any side you wanted and see the war to its end. It was an intricately detailed strategy game that took tons of time and effort to learn its ins and outs. While the US did see a release of this thanks to working designs, I do not believe Sega would put it on an international Saturn Mini. Instead, look for something like Tomb Raider. It sold well enough in both North America and Europe and is a beloved title for those that owned it back then. There also isn't much like it on the old Saturn, giving Sega the variety they'll be looking for. Sega will want a popular fighting game for the Saturn Mini. While any number of Capcom's mighty releases would do, I think Street Fighter Alpha 2 is the one that will get the nod. Of the non-Ramcart releases, this is the best. Incredible graphics, animation, music, and gameplay make it a fine addition. Even more so if they use the Alpha 2 Gold release. Sega will want a solid puzzle game in the mix, and that means we will be seeing Baku Baku Animal almost for sure. It was created for this platform and even has competitive multiplayer. It was also well received back then, so there is little reason for Sega not to include it. Columns was on the Saturn as well, but I think this one has a much better chance. The magic of treasure was once again captured in digital form with Radiant Silvergun. Since we have a few horizontal shooters already, a vertical shooter entry makes sense. It also makes sense because it's unlike any other shooter on the Saturn. Here you get really short stages with complicated boss encounters. It's kinda like a shooter version of Alien Soldier. Sega is gonna want to sell extra controllers, so the 2-player mode seals the deal. Our final entry is here because again, it brings an appeal to the Saturn Mini of getting a title you can't play anywhere else. Burning Rangers is also in a genre you did not see very often on the platform. The free-roaming indoors 3D engine that had you battling fires and bosses was something to see. Sonic Team did the honors, and we haven't seen much of this one since. Sega will want to exploit that fact in the Saturn Mini. The Genesis Mini had a few bonus games included, and I should think that Sega would want to do the same for the Saturn Mini. Since Deep Fear was not released in the US officially, but was translated to English, I think it shows up here as an advertised bonus. It's a good replacement for Resident Evil, and won't cost them a penny in licensing fees. My second bonus release is Return Fire. I think it would be a cheap and easy one for Sega to pick up. It was developed for the Saturn back in 1996, but was cancelled before it was released. This gives Sega a great opportunity to grab that finished game and officially release it on the Saturn here. It's different, and the Saturn's graphics engine is actually quite good. Of course, it would be remiss of me not to discuss the fact that a Saturn Mini has a number of obstacles that makes its worldwide release highly unlikely. As much as it may hurt us to admit it as fans of the device, the Saturn was not popular in most of the world. In fact, it sold downright terrible outside of Japan. This means Sega may be feeling like a Saturn Mini simply does not have the mass market appeal to sell any meaningful numbers, and therefore not worth the effort. It's a genuine concern that puts a big question mark on a product like this. I do believe this has a much higher chance of being a Japanese-only release, however. The Saturn was popular in Japan, as were many of its games. A Saturn Mini with Virtua Fighter and Sakura Wars alone would likely sell numbers that would make it worth it for Sega to do it. That of course would mean a game list that would appeal to a Japanese audience, many of which would not be very friendly to those of us that do not speak the language. I would also like to point out again that the list we just went over are the games that I would expect from Sega and not my actual wish list. The games I would want on a Saturn Mini would be quite different and admittedly completely unrealistic. I'd load it down with third-party fighters, shooters, and of course Dragon Force and Shining the Holy Ark, two games Sega seems to have completely forgotten even exist. Ultimately, the Saturn Mini is more of a pipe dream than anything else. Advances in emulation and the hardware that drives it closes the gap a bit on making it a reality, and I really do hope that Sega revisits these games at some point in the future. I'm Sega Lord X, thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.